Peter, a lot of your training for pilot training in the Second World War was in Canada. Tell us a little about that.
Yes, well, I said when we landed we arrived at Montreal and then went to Lachine. At Lachine we were issued with, and I said this about the Canadian...
Yes.
Yeah. So we were then posted to my group was posted to Windsor Mills in Quebec, which was near the town of Sherbrooke, and was originally a flying instructing school, and was still, it was an odd setup there because it was still a civilian flying instructor school, and the instructors were all honorary sergeants, but they were still civilians. They had the honorary rank of sergeant, and they wore the civilian type uniform. It was a peculiar setup. It was still called Windsor Mills Flying Instructors School Limited, and we were not, although we were in RAF discipline, it was very, very mild discipline. We trained on Canadian Fleet Finch II aircraft, and when we arrived it was still winter and everything was covered in ice, and the aircraft were flying on skis, not with wheels, they had skis. And so they didn't put us on to flying straight away because the break, as they called it, was due when the snow would melt, and they wanted us to start flying with wheels on the aircraft. So we watched them flying with skis, and then the break came and they refitted the aircraft with wheels. The snow disappeared, or most of it, and then we watched blokes who'd been landing on skis then start landing on wheels, and a surprising number of them did ground loops because they landed with drift on, and it didn't matter if you landed with drift on with skis because you just slid sideways, but with wheels on you whipped round in a curve and you dug in one wing usually. So anyway, when we started we were flying on wheels. My instructor, we started flying, and I found that I could fly alright, but I couldn't keep straight on takeoff. I found that I was overcorrecting all the time, and I couldn't get it right. So one morning I went out to fly, and the instructor said, "Take your boots off." He said, "Yeah, take your boots off." So I took my boots off, got in and flew in socks, and took off dead straight, no problem at all. And he realised that I hadn't been able to feel the rudder with my boots, so I flew in socks for that session. Next session I came out wearing plimsolls, and then I went to shoes, and later on I went to boots, and I managed to cope with it all right. We did most of the training we did there was all the normal things, including instrument flying. That was quite interesting. One of the more unusual things that you did in instrument flying was recovery from unusual positions, which the instructor would put the aircraft into a position and say, "You have control," and you then you were under the hood, so you couldn't see out. By looking at the instruments, you had to get it flying straight and level again. One of these was a climbing turn where the natural thing to do was to push the stick forward when you saw what the aircraft was slowing up. So you push the stick forward, and then you suddenly found that it was increasing and you were going into a spiral dive. That was quite tricky to get out of. And then the most difficult one was where he did it a half loop and gave you control when you were upside down at the top of a loop. With that, if you realised that all you knew was that the aircraft increased in speed and then slowed up in speed, so you thought, we're climbing now, I'll push the stick forward. You push the stick forward and immediately stalled, fell out of the sky, and the only thing you could do was to centralise everything and wait, and eventually the aircraft straightened up and came out. So, having sort of sussed what had happened once, I realised what it was, and as soon as he said, "You have control," I centralised everything and waited until the aircraft started to pull out of its own accord. So that's how it worked. And that was inertial training. We then had a couple of weeks leave before we went to service flying training in Montreal, and that was after 2 weeks leave, which again is another story.
Thanks, Peter.